Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. Imagine the darkness before dawn, the sea breathing slowly beneath a pale sky, the scent of salt and oil thick in the air. It is December 7th, 1941, 10 miles off the coast of Oahu, Hawaii. Aboard the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-24, Lieutenant Mochitsura Hashimoto, torpedo officer, peers through the dim light as a midget submarine slips silently away, gliding toward Pearl Harbor. Can you picture it? The stillness before the storm, the hum of engines beneath the waves, the moment before history shatters. Hours later, the horizon burns. Columns of smoke twist upward from Battleship Row. Flames lick the sky above Honolulu. Across the Pacific, Japanese officers rejoice. Their impossible dream, it seems, has come true. The mighty United States, the so-called industrial giant, lies crippled. Around Hashimoto, voices ring with triumph. They are certain the blow is fatal, that American naval power has been broken forever, that Japan's technological brilliance will secure her dominance across the seas. But beneath that smoke, in those wrecked harbors and ruined ships, something else is taking shape, something far deadlier than any bomb dropped that morning. The seeds of Japan's downfall are already there, hidden in plain sight. Even now, deep inside American submarines, a weapon meant to avenge Pearl Harbor is being loaded. A weapon so flawed, so disastrously designed, that Japanese intelligence dismisses it as proof of American inferiority. How could they know that this very weakness would evolve into a strength, driving the most destructive submarine campaign the world would ever witness? The story of Japan's naval defeat was not written in the dazzling carrier battles that would soon capture the headlines. Coral Sea, Midway, Leyte Gulf, but in the quiet arithmetic of failure and misunderstanding. It began long before Pearl Harbor, born of arrogance and disbelief. May 13th, 1940. Picture an office in Tokyo, the scent of paper and ink heavy in the air. A man, identity still classified, walks in and hands the U.S. naval attaché an extraordinary gift: detailed intelligence about Japan's most secret naval weapon, the Type 93 oxygen torpedo. The Allies would later call it the Long Lance, and for good reason. It was a masterpiece of engineering, a weapon so advanced it should have filled American strategists with dread. Consider its power: a range of over 22,000 yards at 48 knots, faster than many destroyers could run, or 33,000 yards at reduced speed. It carried a warhead of 1,080 pounds of high explosive. No other torpedo on Earth came close. The informant provided everything: blueprints, performance data, battle doctrines, a full revelation of how Japan intended to fight and win its night battles at sea. The Office of Naval Intelligence did its duty. It analyzed, reviewed, and sent the report to the Bureau of Ordnance for technical evaluation. And there, in that moment of fatal pride, the truth was lost. The Bureau rejected the intelligence outright. Why? Because of prejudice? The quiet, insidious belief that Asians could not outthink Western engineers. The very idea that Japan had mastered the use of pure oxygen as a torpedo propellant was dismissed as absurd. Too dangerous, too sophisticated. The report was archived, forgotten, buried beneath bureaucracy. And so as months passed and war crept closer, that arrogance, that refusal to believe, would exact its price. Thousands of Allied sailors would pay for it with their lives, and dozens of ships would vanish beneath the waves. Think for a moment about how dangerous arrogance can be, not only in battle, but in belief. Before the first shot was ever fired in the Pacific War, a quiet poison had seeped into Western military thought: contempt. It was a contempt so deep that it blinded even the most brilliant strategists. The Americans and many of their allies simply could not imagine that Japan, that an Asian power, could match, let alone surpass, Western science or technology. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, a man destined to earn 4 Navy crosses and to command the might of American amphibious forces, had stood before Congress in 1940 and spoken words that history would make bitterly ironic. Japanese pilots, he claimed, were biologically inferior. Their eyes, their spatial awareness, their very perception supposedly flawed by race. Can you picture it? In the halls of power, before the war began, pseudoscience paraded as fact. Reports insisted Japanese aviators lacked the night vision to fight effectively, that their flight training was crude, their machines mere copies of outdated Western aircraft. Even in 1941, as war clouds gathered, the U.S. Army Air Corps clung to that illusion. Intelligence summaries described the Mitsubishi Zero, soon to become the terror of the Pacific, as a derivative of obsolete American designs. They were confident that any encounter would prove the superiority of American aircraft and pilots. But what happened next shattered that illusion like glass. When the war began, Japanese pilots flew not inferior machines, but technological marvels. Faster, more agile, deadlier than anything the Allies expected. Their tactics were disciplined, precise, devastating. Over the Philippines, Wake Island, and the Dutch East Indies, they ruled the skies. The cost of that blindness, of those smug reports and dismissive assumptions, was paid in blood. And on the sea, the reckoning was even greater. The long-lance Torpedo, the same Type 93 weapon American intelligence had dismissed as fantasy, began its grim work. 7 U.S. cruisers would meet their end because of it. Quincy, Vincennes, Astoria, Chicago, and Northampton among them, all struck by weapons launched from ranges that defied belief. 9 destroyers would vanish beneath the waves. The proud carrier Hornet, already crippled at the Battle of Santa Cruz, received its final death blow from a long lance fired by a Japanese destroyer. More than 300 American sailors died because of those torpedoes. Imagine the terror of those moments. Lookouts straining their eyes against the horizon, seeing nothing but empty sea. Captains confident they were safe, steering beyond what they thought was the limit of enemy reach. Then, out of nowhere, explosions, fire, steel twisting decks lifting from the sea. The torpedoes had come from ships 15, even 20 miles away, from beyond sight, beyond comprehension. The first of these shocking encounters unfolded on February 27, 1942, in the Battle of the Java Sea. Picture it, the Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman commanding a fragile alliance of American, British, Dutch, and Australian vessels, steaming out from Surabaya to meet an oncoming Japanese invasion force. His fleet was a patchwork. Heavy cruisers, Exeter and Houston, light cruisers, De Ruyter, Java, and Perth, and 9 destroyers from 4 navies, 4 languages, 4 tactical doctrines, 1 desperate mission, exhausted crews, frayed communications, and no time to prepare. Against them stood a Japanese force that had trained and fought together for years, cohesive, disciplined, deadly. At 1600 hours, the two sides sighted each other, the Japanese heavy cruisers Haguro and Nachi. The light cruiser Naka and their escorting destroyers began their deadly ballet, maneuvering to unleash their torpedo batteries. At 1633, Naka fired 4 Type 93s from a range of 15,000 yards. Minutes later, her destroyers followed with 27 more, all from impossible distances. At 1652, Haguro added 8 more torpedoes from a staggering 22,000 yards, over 11 nautical miles. Imagine the sea at that moment, nearly 40 invisible killers racing through the water at 12 feet of depth, leaving no trace, no trail of bubbles, their oxygen engines silent as death. Allied sonar, trained to detect torpedoes only at much shorter ranges, remained blind. Then, at 1713, disaster struck. One long lance slammed into the Dutch destroyer Kortna amidships. The explosion tore her apart, broke her spine, and within 2 minutes, she was gone, taking most of her 150-man crew with her. Panic rippled through the Allied formation. Commanders, unable to fathom torpedoes coming from such ranges, concluded that submarines must be attacking them. The fleet scattered, maneuvering wildly to avoid phantom submarines, breaking cohesion, surrendering any chance of coordinated resistance. For 7 brutal hours the battle raged. Dorman pressed forward again and again, desperate to reach the invasion convoy, but the Japanese, calm and calculating, blocked every attempt. Beneath the roar of guns and the crash of waves, one truth became inescapable. The Allies were fighting not just an enemy fleet, they were fighting their own blindness. Picture the night sky over the Java Sea, black, immense, and alive with fire. Shells arc through the darkness, the sea flashes with the light of exploding metal, and ships groan under the strain of combat. The Allied line is faltering. The British heavy cruiser Exeter staggers under the impact of an 8-inch shell that smashes through her boiler room. Steam bursts forth like a wounded beast's final breath. Her engines slow. She slips out of formation, crippled but still fighting. Nearby, the destroyer Electra, small, defiant, brave, lunges forward to launch a torpedo attack. For a moment, it is as if courage alone could turn the tide. But gunfire from Japanese cruisers finds her, tears her apart, and she sinks beneath the waves, her decks aflame, even as her crew fights to the last. Through the long tropical night, Admiral Dorman presses on, his force now reduced to 4 weary cruisers, the American destroyers gone, their fuel and ammunition spent, continues the desperate search for the enemy invasion convoy. The sea is vast, silent, deceptive. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese are waiting. At 23:25, aboard the cruisers Haguro and Nachi, radar operators track the Allied formation, a technology the Allies still underestimate. Commands are given, calculations made, tubes flooded. Another spread of Type 93 torpedoes, those invisible assassins, slices into the water. 7 minutes later, at 23:32, one finds its mark. Java, the proud Dutch light cruiser, is struck amidships. In an instant, the explosion ignites her magazines, a white-hot flash, then a roar that splits the night. The ship simply ceases to exist as a fighting vessel, disintegrating into a storm of fire and twisted steel. Of her 600 crew, only 88 survive. Then at 23:38, tragedy strikes again. Another long lance smashes into Dorman's flagship, De Ruyter. The torpedo detonates her ammunition stores, and the cruiser erupts in a towering inferno. The admiral, his officers, and 345 of his crew go down with her. The sea swallows the flames, and with them, the last hope of resistance. By dawn, the Battle of the Java Sea is over. 2 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and more than 2,300 Allied sailors are lost. Japanese casualties? Minimal. 4 transports accidentally hit by their own torpedoes, and 1 destroyer slightly damaged. The invasion of Java proceeds unhindered, the way cleared by precision and pride. But perhaps the greatest casualty that night is truth itself. American intelligence officers, poring over reports from survivors, refuse to believe what they read. Torpedoes launched from over 10 miles away? Impossible. Attacks from cruisers, not submarines? Unthinkable. They dismiss the accounts as confusion, as hysteria from men broken by battle. Once again, arrogance triumphs over evidence. And so, the same pattern repeats. Ignorance wrapped in certainty, leading to one of the most devastating nights in U.S. naval history, the Battle of Savo Island, August 9, 1942. Imagine the waters off Guadalcanal just after midnight. Allied ships, American and Australian cruisers, guard the landing forces ashore. Then, from the black sky above, parachute flares bloom like ghostly suns dropped by Japanese float planes. The flares burn white against the clouds, silhouetting the Allied ships, perfect targets glowing helplessly in the dark. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's task force, a deadly column of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer, closes in. Within minutes, torpedoes are in the water, guns begin their thunder, and chaos reigns. The battle lasts barely half an hour, 32 minutes of slaughter. When the firing ceases, the sea is littered with burning metal and bodies. The Australian heavy cruiser Canberra is sinking, torn open by 2 Type 93 torpedoes and 24 8-inch shells. The American cruisers Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria are all aflame, mortally wounded. Each will slip beneath the waves before dawn. The cruiser Chicago, hit by a torpedo that blows off her bow, limps away into the night. Over 1,000 Allied sailors are dead, many trapped below decks as fire devours their ships, others vaporized in instant detonations. Survivors speak of torpedoes coming from impossible angles, of weapons that seemed to turn in the water, that left no wakes, no warning. They describe explosions from directions no one thought an enemy ship could reach. But again, the analysts on shore dismiss their words. Combat stress, they say. Panic, exaggeration. Intelligence assessments conclude that Japanese torpedoes are roughly equivalent to American ones. Perhaps slightly better, but nothing revolutionary. It will take until 1943, 2 years of loss, thousands of dead, before the truth is undeniable. When divers recover intact Type 93 torpedoes from sunken Japanese destroyers, the evidence is there in cold steel. The oxygen-fueled Long Lance is real exactly as the early reports described. By then, the sea has already claimed its price. The arrogance that once blinded America to Japan's capabilities has mirrored the same blindness in Japan's own intelligence assessments. 2 great powers, each underestimating the other, both prisoners of pride. And while Japanese analysts take satisfaction in early American failures, reports of U.S. torpedoes misfiring, detonators failing, submariners returning home empty-handed. They do not yet see that their confidence will one day turn to fear. The weapon that Japan mocks as defective will soon evolve into the tool of its ruin. Imagine the ocean at dawn, still heavy with the echoes of Pearl Harbor's devastation. It is December 14th, 1941, barely a week after the attack that has plunged America into war. Off the southern coast of Mindanao in the Philippines, the submarine Seawolf prowls beneath the waves. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder, peers through the periscope. There, a Japanese freighter lies at anchor, motionless, unescorted, unaware that death waits just below the surface. Warder maneuvers into perfect firing position, range 3,000 yards. Ideal angle. He gives the order. 8 Mark 14 torpedoes, the pride of the U.S. Navy, each costing over $10,000, each a masterpiece of American engineering, surge from their tubes toward the target. Every man aboard holds his breath. Then, nothing. 7 torpedoes miss completely, sliding harmlessly under the hull or veering off into the deep. The 8th strikes home with a hollow clang that echoes through Seawolf's steel skin. The crew waits for the thunderous explosion that never comes. Silence. The torpedo has hit, but it does not detonate. Above, the Japanese freighter's crew, now fully aware, scrambles to life. The engines roar. The ship begins to move. The submarine dives, bracing for the inevitable counterattack. The depth charges, the hunt, but no attack comes. The freighter, it turns out, carries no anti-submarine weapons at all. It sails away untouched, while Seawolf, humiliated, slips into the darkness. 10 days later, on Christmas Eve, another submarine, Sargo, commanded by Commander Tyrell Jacobs, finds 4 Japanese cargo ships off the coast of Indochina. 4 easy targets, steaming in loose formation, without escort. Perfect conditions, calm sea, clear visibility, steady targets. Jacobs, a disciplined and skilled officer, executes a textbook attack. 12 torpedoes in total, 3 for each ship, fired from ranges so close, so precise, the outcome should have been certain, not one explosion. Through his periscope, Jacobs watches the unbelievable unfold. Torpedoes streaking beneath the hulls, detonations occurring prematurely in open water, direct hits that result only in dull thuds. No fires, no sinking ships, just silence and disbelief. In desperation, Jacobs lines up one final shot at a large freighter that has stopped to investigate the commotion. 4 more torpedoes. 4 perfect firings. All 4 pass directly beneath the motionless ship, harmless. When Sargo limps back into Manila Bay on December 30th, her crew is broken, their faith shattered. 24 torpedoes expended, and not a single kill. Jacobs, furious and ashamed, files his report. He states plainly that the Mark 14 torpedoes are running too deep, far below their set depths, and are therefore passing harmlessly under their targets. But in Washington, the Bureau of Ordnance, the institution responsible for torpedo design, reacts not with alarm, but with scorn. Their verdict is swift: operator error. According to them, the problem lies with the men, not the machine. The captains, they claim, lack discipline. The crews, inadequate training. The submariners, poor maintenance habits. The Bureau insists, with bureaucratic arrogance, that the Mark 14 is the most advanced, most thoroughly tested torpedo ever built. They dismiss the reports as excuses from commanders unwilling to admit their own incompetence. And so, for nearly 2 years, this illusion persists. American submarines prowl the Pacific, firing thousands of defective torpedoes. Japanese merchant ships, struck again and again, continue to sail, some limping home with unexploded American torpedoes lodged in their hulls, mute proof of failure. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japanese intelligence officers are listening. They intercept American radio traffic, decrypt partial messages, interrogate captured submariners. The picture they assemble is both accurate and disastrously misleading. They report to Tokyo that American torpedoes are primitive, plagued by design flaws, that U.S. submariners are timid, poorly trained, lacking the fighting spirit. The conclusion seems obvious. America's industry may be vast, but its weapons do not work. Its submarines are a nuisance, not a threat. This analysis, so confident, so wrong, becomes one of the most fateful misjudgments in modern warfare. Throughout 1942, the same grim pattern repeats again and again. American submarines stalk their prey with skill and courage, line up perfect attacks, and achieve nothing. The statistics are staggering. In that first year of war, U.S. submarines fire 1,140 torpedoes. Their crews claim 211 ships sunk, totaling nearly 1.3 million tons. But after the war, when Japanese records are examined, the truth emerges. Only 109 ships were actually sunk. barely 3% of the reported tonnage. Commanders file report after report, each one more desperate than the last, describing torpedoes that run too deep, explode too soon, or strike without detonating. Japanese merchant captains begin sending their own reports. Stories of torpedoes embedded harmlessly in their hulls, retrieved later by naval technicians who study them with fascination and growing confidence. Those reports reinforce a fatal delusion. The Imperial Navy concludes that the American submarine threat is trivial, easily contained. Convoy escorts are deemed unnecessary. Resources are funneled instead into battleships and aircraft carriers, the glamorous instruments of the decisive battle doctrine that defines Japanese strategy. The result? A complacency so deep that when the truth finally surfaces, it will already be too late. Because the Mark 14 torpedoes' failures, as disastrous as they seem, are not permanent. Beneath the humiliation lies the potential for transformation. The weapons defects, born from the parsimony of the Great Depression when testing budgets were nearly non-existent, are real, but they can be fixed. 3 hidden flaws, each masking the other, lie at the heart of the problem. Understanding them and how they were finally uncovered requires a look at how the Mark 14 was conceived. It was designed in 1931, meant to replace the aging Mark 10 of World War I vintage and to arm the new generation of American fleet submarines. No one could yet imagine that this untested weapon, conceived in thrift and arrogance, would one day help turn the tide of a world at war. Imagine a drawing board ambition given shape in steel and explosive. The Mark 14 was conceived as the thunderbolt for the new fleet submarines then rising from the yards. Boats like Gato, Wahoo, and Tang that would later form the backbone of America's undersea war. The specifications read like the wish list of an engineer determined to leap decades ahead. The torpedo measured 20 feet 6 inches, weighed roughly 3,000 pounds, carried a 643-pound Torpex warhead, and promised a reach of 4,500 yards at 46 knots or 9,000 yards at 31.5 knots. Its guidance would rely on a sophisticated gyroscope. Depth would be governed by a hydrostatic device, and, most daring of all, it would carry the Mark 6 exploder, a magnetic influence fuse designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and literally break its back. Think about that for a moment. No longer must a torpedo strike the hull to finish a ship. Instead, the Mark 6 would sense the subtle distortion of the Earth's magnetic field caused by a mass of steel passing overhead, and once a threshold was reached, would trigger the warhead at the most destructive point beneath the target. It was cutting edge, the kind of idea that had been toyed with by German U-boats in World War I and used with mixed results by the British. Only now the Americans intended to make it more sensitive, more reliable, more advanced than anything before. But brilliance on paper is not the same as reliability at sea, and here the cost accounting of an era of austerity intruded. In 1931, a single Mark 14 cost over $10,000, a sum that, in later terms, swells into the hundreds of thousands. During the Depression, with budgets gutted and Congress scrutinizing every penny, the Navy balked at wasting these expensive weapons in live fire trials. So instead of detonating real warheads against real ships, testers used exercise heads, recoverable dummy warheads filled with water and air, to approximate the overall weight. Fired in controlled ranges, the torpedoes were hauled back, inspected, and reused. Economical? Yes. Adequate? No. That compromise hid fatal differences. Although an exercise head matched the combat warhead in gross mass, its internal mass distribution differed fundamentally. The combat warhead concentrated 643 pounds of explosive in the forward section. The exercise head dispersed water through that space. Trim and hydrodynamics responded to that difference in ways that would only reveal themselves under real propulsion and in real sea conditions. Equally damaging was the absence of live-fire trials against actual hulls to test the Mark VI response in the noisy, chaotic environment of combat. The magnetic exploder was so secret that submarine skippers were not permitted to inspect or understand it. Acceptance into service rested on mathematics, lab tests, and recoverable firings that, crucially, never mimicked true battle conditions. The first consequence was simple and brutal. Depth control failed. Every Mark 14 in service in the early war ran substantially deeper than it was set to run, 10 to 11 feet deeper on average. Why? During final development, engineers increased the explosive charge by roughly 80 pounds to boost lethality, but failed to recalibrate the hydrostatic depth sensor to account for the altered mass and trim. Worse, the hydrostatic sensor sat where water flow over the torpedo's body created pressure fluctuations that confused the mechanism. As the weapon accelerated, the moving water produced a local pressure drop at the sensor location, the same Bernoulli effect that creates lift on an airplane wing, and the depth control interpreted that pressure drop as the torpedo being too near the surface. Its automatic response was to trim deeper. The faster the weapon ran, the more the effect intensified. The result? Torpedoes set to run at 10 feet, intended to strike a ship's waterline, actually cruised at 20 to 25 feet and slipped harmlessly beneath targets. Why did no one notice during testing? Because static pool trials, immersing a non-moving tube in still water, would not create the dynamic pressure field that fooled the sensor, and the exercise heads used in dynamic tests carried depth recorders that suffered the same misplaced sensor problem and therefore reported consistent but false readings. The defect existed in every torpedo. The testing regime was simply blind to it. This alone would have been disastrous, yet it was compounded and partly hidden by a second catastrophe, the Mark II magnetic exploder. In the laboratory, this device seemed brilliant, a torque of cleverness that allowed detonation at the keel without a direct hull strike. In the real world, it proved erratic. Earth's magnetic field varies with latitude, local geology, and other factors. The Mark VI had been calibrated near the Naval Torpedo Station in Newport, Rhode Island, where local magnetic properties suited its sensitivity settings. In the far-flung waters of the Pacific, Java, the Philippines, Guadalcanal, and the approaches to Japan, magnetic conditions were different enough that the exploder's calibration was often wrong. The consequences took several forms. Some torpedoes detonated prematurely, 50 or 100 yards before their intended marks, when the magnetic sensor detected a field change at excessive range. Such premature explosions did little more than warn the target and allow evasive action. Others simply failed to fire at all as they passed under a hull because the local magnetic change never reached the preset threshold. Submarine commanders, peering through periscopes at what looked like perfect hits, watched in fury as explosions either occurred harmlessly ahead of the ship or not at all. So the Mark XIV's tragedy was not a single flaw, but the interplay of three hidden failures: incorrect depth due to trim and sensor placement, the fragile and miscalibrated magnetic exploder, tuned to the wrong geophysical context, and inadequate testing protocols that never exposed either problem. Each defect masked the others, making the diagnosis fiendishly difficult. Only by understanding how the torpedo was designed, how its tests deceived its makers, and how its components interacted in real seas, can we see why an instrument intended to dominate the oceans instead produced months of heartache and missed opportunity? Imagine the bitterness of a flawless plan dissolving in a single metallic sound. Crews reported these failures again and again, filing meticulous after-action reports that recommended one simple corrective: disable the magnetic feature. What did the Bureau of Ordnance do? It blamed the men. Maintenance errors, bad calibration, sloppy adherence to operating protocols. That was the official verdict. The Torpedo was, in Washington's view, beyond reproach. The only fault lay in human hands. But the truth was more tangled. The deep-running syndrome and the errant magnetic exploder hid one another so effectively that finding the root cause became fiendishly hard. If torpedoes passed well beneath their targets, of course the magnetic influence fuse would never sense the ship's hull. Fix the depth and the exploder ought to work. Yet when depth settings were finally corrected by mid-1942, the magnetic device still misfired, and a third, even more insidious defect revealed itself in the contact exploder. The Mark VI combined magnetic and contact firing systems into one unit. The designers assumed the contact mechanism would act as a reliable backup if the magnetic function failed. That contact system used a firing pin arrangement that had proved dependable in older, slower torpedoes. The Mark X had topped out at 36 knots. The Mark XIV screamed along at 46 knots, nearly 28% faster. And nobody had properly tested whether the old firing pin design could survive the far greater deceleration of a high-speed impact. Think about the physics. A torpedo slamming into steel at 46 knots undergoes a brutal, almost instantaneous deceleration. The Mark IX's firing pin was relatively heavy and retained by a spring meant to prevent accidental discharge during handling, while still allowing the pin to strike the detonator on impact. At the Mark XIV's impact velocities, especially when the torpedo struck at the textbook 90-degree angle submarine officers were trained to achieve, the pin would bind in its housing instead of traveling forward. Friction and inertial forces overwhelmed the spring, and the pin never reached the detonator. The most accurate, bravest shots, direct, perpendicular hits, were therefore the most likely to be duds. Only glancing oblique impacts, which produced gentler decelerations, allowed the firing pin to operate as intended. This was not an unknown problem in naval ordnance. A similar issue had been discovered and fixed in earlier torpedo models back in 1922 by using a lighter pin and a stiffer spring. But when the Mark VI's designers grafted the new magnetic system onto the contact mechanism, that earlier lesson was apparently ignored. No adequate high-speed tests were run to verify the contact exploder's function at the Mark XIV's velocities. The consequences were humiliating and stark. Japanese merchantmen began to arrive in port-bearing dents from American torpedoes, sometimes with unexploded Mark XIVs stuck in their hulls. Mute, embarrassing evidence of perfect attacks that had failed. The human cost during 1942 and early 1943 was enormous. Submarine skippers stalked targets for hours, maneuvering at immense personal risk to set up ideal shots, fired spreads of torpedoes that should have ended encounters, and watched in helpless fury as nothing happened or as premature explosions only warned the enemy. Morale plunged. Men who had trained for years to become submarine warriors and who accepted that submarining carried the highest casualty rate of any American combat arm found their faith betrayed by the weapon they were ordered to trust. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Warder's experience was painfully typical. In January 1942, off Talomo Bay in the Philippines, Seawolf encountered an 8,000-ton Japanese transport at anchor, stationary, unescorted, a prize at point-blank range. Warder fired 4 Mark 14s. He heard 4 dull clangs as they struck the hull. None exploded. The transport, alerted but unhurt, got underway and zigzagged away while calling for air support. Warder then reloaded with older Mark 10 torpedoes, World War I vintage, lacking the Mark 14's technological frills, but blessedly reliable. The first Mark 10 detonated against the stern. The second struck amidships and broke the transport's back. She sank in minutes. Warder's after-action report was blunt. The Mark 14 was defective and should be withdrawn. The Bureau replied not by grounding the weapon, but by recommending additional training in torpedo maintenance for Warder. Lieutenant Commander Eugene McKinney aboard Tambor experienced the same cruel pattern. In April 1942, he fired 8 torpedoes at a Japanese destroyer from some 800 yards. He heard 8 metallic hollow clangs as each struck the thin hull, and none exploded. Imagine the cold metallic silence after a missed thunderclap. A line of torpedoes that strike like clockwork, yet refuse to finish their work. None exploded. The destroyer, now fully alert to Tambor's presence and bearing, swung into a furious counterattack. Depth charges detonated so close they shattered light bulbs throughout the submarine and opened leaks in multiple systems. Tambor escaped by the skin of her teeth, surfacing after nightfall in heavy seas to ventilate the boat and patch the damage. McKinney recovered 8 of the torpedoes as they floated, warheads untouched, and examined them with a growing, burning certainty. He radioed Pearl Harbor with a blistering, painstaking report cataloging exactly what he had observed. The Bureau of Ordnance's answer was as predictable as it was infuriating. Improper handling, lax maintenance, operator fault, not design failure. Tokyo's intelligence ears were listening. Japanese intercepts, partial decryptions of American submarine radio traffic, and reports from agents in Allied ports carried back a simple, seductive conclusion. American submariners blamed their own gear for combat failures. To Japanese analysts, this read as proof. The weapons were primitive, the crews poorly trained, American industry unable to produce reliable ordnance. Thus did one side's misfortune become the other's confidence. Because of that confidence, Japanese anti-submarine doctrine remained woefully misplaced. Escort vessels and patrol craft, intended more for surface action than for hunting stealthy predators beneath the waves, lacked effective sonar, sufficient depth charge armament, and the tactical doctrine to pursue submarines methodically. Naval construction programs favored battleships and fleet carriers, the instruments of a decisive fleet action, rather than the less glamorous but vital convoy escorts. That choice, guided in part by misleading intelligence, would prove costly. The breaking point came in mid-1943, when 2 incidents shattered the Bureau's complacency and forced a grudging admission of reality. First, on June 10, 1943, Commander Roy Benson, aboard Trigger, sighted the fleet aircraft carrier Hio, one of Japan's most valuable capital ships, and closed to a virtually guaranteed firing range of 1,200 yards. Benson launched a carefully calculated 6-torpedo spread intended to ensure multiple hits, even if the carrier executed evasive turns. Fate intervened. 2 torpedoes missed after Hio's emergency maneuver. 1 detonated prematurely 80 yards short, visible as a dull underwater bloom through Trigger's periscope but causing no damage. 1 struck Hio's hull and proved a dud. 2 struck and detonated as designed, inflicting moderate damage, slowing the carrier and igniting fires. Destroyer escorts immediately counterattacked with depth charges, and Hio limped away to Sasebo for emergency repairs. patched and back in service within 6 weeks. She would go on to take part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, and only much later be sunk by the submarine Archerfish. Consider the strategic sting. 2 of 6 torpedoes failing in that single attack denied the United States the opportunity to put a major fleet carrier permanently out of action at a time when every carrier mattered. The ripple effects of torpedo unreliability reached far beyond a moment's frustration. They shaped the operational balance of the Pacific. The second, even more incontrovertible episode came on July 24, 1943. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, on Tenosa's second war patrol, sighted the 950-ton whale factory ship Tonan Maru No. 3 alone and unescorted south of Truk, the very definition of a submariner's prize. Whale oil was a strategic commodity, used in explosives production and 1,000 industrial processes. Sinking such a vessel would be both materially damaging and demoralizing. Tenosa closed to 4,000 yards and fired 4 torpedoes. Daspit observed 2 hits that stopped the giant dead in the water. He fired 2 more, and both hit. Picture the still Pacific horizon on that July morning. A perfect hunt, a perfect target, and the promise of redemption for every failed patrol that had come before. 6 torpedo hits should have been more than enough to send any ship to the bottom. Yet, Tonan Maru No. 3 remained stubbornly afloat, dead in the water, but refusing to die. Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit, aboard Tenosa, had time to think and to act. No enemy escorts prowled nearby. The sea was calm, the air sharp with the metallic tang of fuel and salt. Methodically, Daspit maneuvered Tenosa into an ideal firing position, 875 yards abeam of the target, the very definition of a perfect shot. At that range, and at a 90-degree impact angle, there was no room for error. He fired 9 more torpedoes, observing each shot through his periscope as Japanese machine guns rattled from the listing freighter. One after another, the torpedoes hit squarely, and one after another, they failed. Daspit heard each dull, gut-twisting thud reverberate through Tenosa's hull, the sound of flawless engineering betrayed by a single missing heartbeat. Detonation. 15 torpedoes in total, 15 perfect attacks. 6 had struck and failed. 9 had struck and failed. None ran erratic, none detonated prematurely, none missed their mark. The Mark 14 had done everything it was designed to do, except explode. Daspit, grim-faced but disciplined, decided to save one final torpedo. He marked it carefully, left it unfired, and cleared the area before Japanese aircraft could arrive. That one intact weapon would become the final piece of evidence, the smoking gun in a long, simmering case against the Bureau of Ordnance. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of submarines, Pacific Fleet, had been waiting for proof. A submariner himself since the 1920s, Lockwood knew what his captains were enduring. 2 years of flawless attacks ending in failure, 2 years of being told that the problem lay with them, not the weapon. He had read Daspit's report, studied the photographs, and seen the results that bureaucrats in Washington refused to face. Now, he had irrefutable evidence. Lockwood ordered immediate live testing. His engineers constructed a simple but decisive experiment. Dummy torpedoes dropped from a crane onto steel plates set at different angles, simulating real impact conditions. The results were damning. At high speeds, especially at those textbook-perfect 90-degree angles, the Mark 6 contact exploder's firing pin jammed in its housing before it could strike the detonator. The harder and more direct the hit, the greater the failure rate. In other words, submarine captains who executed their training flawlessly were being punished by physics itself. The discovery forced Lockwood's team to rethink everything. Then, from an unlikely corner of wartime memory, came the spark of innovation. Engineers at Pearl Harbor had once examined the wreckage of downed Japanese aircraft, noting with surprise that their propeller blades were made of lightweight aluminum alloy rather than steel, resilient, yet flexible enough to absorb stress. The insight was elegant in its simplicity. If the firing pin and the exploder were made of aluminum instead of steel, it would carry less inertia upon impact and be less likely to seize. Tests confirmed it. At last, the mechanical curse was broken. By September 1943, 21 months after Pearl Harbor, newly modified torpedoes with lightweight aluminum firing pins and recalibrated exploders began reaching submarines at Pearl Harbor and Fremantle. The change was nothing short of revolutionary. From that point forward, the American submarine force transformed almost overnight from a frustrated, demoralized corps into one of the deadliest instruments of naval warfare in history. For nearly 2 years, they had gone to sea with a weapon more dangerous to their morale than to the enemy. 3 hidden defects, depth control, magnetic influence, and contact detonation, had combined to make the Mark 14 unreliable to the point of absurdity. Submarine captains had compensated through instinct and ingenuity, setting shallower depths, disabling the magnetic feature in defiance of orders, firing at oblique angles to coax the firing pin into doing its job. But these were desperate improvisations, not solutions. Now, at last, the weapon matched the courage of the men who used it. The disease was cured, and the reckoning for Japan's merchant fleet was about to begin. After September 1943, the ocean itself seemed to tilt in America's favor. The Mark 14 torpedo, once a curse whispered in every wardroom, finally became the weapon it was meant to be. Depth control worked. The magnetic exploder was gone for good. The contact exploder fired cleanly, no matter the angle or speed. The same commanders who had spent 2 brutal years learning the art of submarine warfare with crippled weapons now held in their hands a tool worthy of their skill. The transformation was instant and devastating. For 2 years, Japanese naval planners had believed the submarine threat manageable. American torpedoes, they thought, were erratic, underpowered, unreliable. Their escorts were assigned to protect battleships and carriers, not cargo ships. Convoy defense was a secondary concern. The merchant fleet, the fragile bloodstream of Japan's war machine, steamed across the Pacific in complacent confidence, carrying oil, ore, food, and machinery with little more than token protection. That illusion ended in fire. On December 22, 1944, Commander Reuben Whittaker, aboard Flasher, intercepted a convoy off Indochina. In minutes, he maneuvered into the perfect firing position and launched 6 torpedoes. 6 hits, 6 detonations, 3 tankers, Omarosa and Maru, Arita Maru, and Otawasan Maru, vanished in explosions that turned the sea into burning oil. In less than 20 minutes, nearly 30,000 tons of shipping and hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel were gone. Japan's war engine was bleeding out. Commander Eugene Fluckey aboard Barb carried the campaign to mythic heights. On his 11th patrol in 1945, he sank 17 ships over 96,000 tons, a record that would stand unbroken. In one furious hour off the China coast, Barb destroyed 4 ships in 54 minutes, her torpedoes striking with surgical precision. These were not flukes of luck or chance. They were the deliberate work of men who had endured failure and learned from it, and of weapons that finally did what they were designed to do. The numbers told the story of transformation, In 1942, American submarines fired 1,942 torpedoes and sank 109 ships, barely a fraction of their claims. In 1943, with the defects gradually fixed, they sank 284 ships for over 1.3 million tons. By 1944, the floodgates opened, 6,002 torpedoes fired, 492 ships sunk, more than 2.3 million tons sent to the bottom. Effectiveness had improved tenfold. By war's end, U.S. submarines had sunk 178 Japanese merchant vessels, more than 5 million tons, over half of all Japan's maritime losses. Among their trophies were 201 warships, including the Shinano, the largest carrier ever built, sent under by a single submarine. For Japan, the impact was fatal. The empire was an island chained to the sea. Every drop of oil, every ingot of steel, every grain of rice had to travel by ship. Once the submarine struck in earnest, that chain began to snap. By early 1945, Japan's merchant fleet was down to a quarter of its pre-war size. Oil tankers were dying faster than they could make a single round trip. Steel mills went dark for lack of ore. Aluminum production collapsed. Aircraft factories stood silent. Training flights were canceled for lack of aviation fuel. Even food ships could not run the gauntlet, and the home islands began to starve. The combined fleet, once a symbol of imperial might, lay rusting at anchor, not defeated in battle, but strangled by logistics. Battleships that had crushed Russia at Tsushima and dominated the Pacific in 1942 now floated uselessly in their harbors, their massive fuel tanks dry. The torpedo that had once failed America now failed Japan in the most absolute way imaginable. By 1945, Japan's empire was collapsing not through battle, but through hunger and silence, through ships that never arrived. Army divisions in China, Burma, the Solomons, and countless Pacific garrisons began to wither. Supplies simply stopped coming. Ammunition, food, medicine, spare parts, all depended on freighters that now lay scattered across the ocean floor. Entire units starved in jungle outposts, their fate sealed not by American soldiers, but by unseen submarines that stalked the shipping lanes. The home islands fared little better. Japan had never been self-sufficient in food. It depended on rice from Korea and Southeast Asia, on sugar from Formosa, on the produce of lands it had conquered. By 1945, the submarine blockade had reduced those imports to a trickle. Rice rations were cut again and again. People in Tokyo and Osaka queued for hours for handfuls of millet or sweet potatoes. Black markets thrived in alleyways. The government issued proclamations, slogans, punishments, but no amount of discipline could feed an island nation strangled at sea. Historians later focused on the spectacle of firebombs and mushroom clouds, but those came after the real defeat. The B-29 raids burned cities and killed civilians, yet the war economy had already bled out. You cannot forge steel or build tanks or fly aircraft without fuel and aluminum. Those things had stopped arriving long before Hiroshima. By the summer of 1945, Japan's war was over in every practical sense. The atomic bombs ended it politically. The submarines had already ended it materially. And then came the final irony, the full circle of technological arrogance. The Type 93, long-lance torpedo, the fearsome weapon that had stunned Allied navies in 1942, had by 1944 become little more than a relic. Radar gave American ships warning before any Japanese destroyer could get within launch range. New tactics, zigzagging formations, evasive maneuvers, improved damage control, blunted the weapon's effect. Japan still built destroyers and cruisers optimized for night torpedo attacks, but now they were being used as desperate escorts for merchant convoys that no longer existed. The tide had turned completely. American ships could see at night, fight through cloud and smoke, coordinate across vast distances. Their gunnery was radar-directed, their communications seamless, their numbers overwhelming. Japan's surface fleet, designed for a single decisive battle, found itself outclassed, outnumbered, and out of fuel. The reckoning came at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On June 19, 1944, Commander Herman Kostler aboard Kavala sighted the carrier Shokaku recovering aircraft. At 1 and 200 yards, he fired 6 torpedoes. 4 struck home. The explosions ripped through aviation fuel stores and detonated ordnance. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz, disappeared beneath the waves in minutes, taking 1,263 men with her. Hours later, the submarine Albacore, under Commander James Blanchard, found Taiho, Japan's newest and most heavily armored carrier. 1 torpedo hit her forward. Damage control officers, trusting her strength, made a fatal mistake. They tried to vent gasoline fumes. The vapors spread through the ventilation ducts until 7 hours later, the ship exploded in a single monstrous detonation. Taiho broke apart and sank, killing 1,650 sailors, including Vice Admiral Ozawa's entire staff. 2 submarines, 2 torpedoes, 2 carriers gone. Nearly half of Japan's remaining carrier strength erased before a single American aircraft joined the fight. When American carrier planes arrived that afternoon, they faced a fleet already crippled. The ensuing slaughter, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, destroyed over 600 Japanese aircraft in a day. The Empire's naval aviation, once the terror of the Pacific, ceased to exist as an effective force. And it had begun, fittingly, with submarines. The same silent weapons Japan had once dismissed as inferior had become the instruments of its annihilation. The Long Lance had promised victory through technological genius. The Mark XIV, reborn through brutal necessity, delivered defeat through precision and persistence. Japan's ships were gone, its soldiers stranded, its cities starving. The empire that began the war with faith in its superiority ended it in ruin, undone not by grand fleets or armies, but by steel tubes in the deep, firing torpedoes that finally worked. By late 1944, Japan's defeat at sea was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty playing itself out in steel and fire. Japanese naval aviation, once the terror of the Pacific, was finished. Its surviving pilots were poorly trained, its carriers under constant threat, and its supply lines strangled. What the torpedo failures of 1942 had spared, the re-engineered Mark XIVs of 1944 were now annihilating with precision and fury. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the final demonstration, the moment when the technological balance that had once favored Japan swung irreversibly the other way. On October 23, 1944, Admiral Takeo Kurita's powerful center force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers slipped through the Palawan Passage toward Leyte Gulf. But American code breakers had already read his intentions. 2 submarines, Darter and Dace, were waiting. At dawn, Commander David McClintock aboard Darter picked up the Japanese column on radar, a glittering procession of warships moving through confined waters, unaware that death was tracking them from below. For 4 tense hours, McClintock shadowed the formation, sending contact reports that allowed Dace, commanded by Bladen Claggett, to maneuver into position for a coordinated strike. At 9:27 a.m., Darter fired 6 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Otago, Admiral Kurita's flagship. 4 found their mark. The explosions tore through Otago's hull, knocking out power and flooding her engine rooms. Within minutes, she was listing heavily, fires raging through her decks. Kurita and his staff scrambled overboard into an oil-slicked sea as destroyers tried frantically to pick them up. By 9:55, Otago rolled over and went down, taking 360 men with her, and with them, the nerve center of Kurita's fleet. McClintock then shifted fire to Takao, loosing 4 more torpedoes. All struck. The cruiser's back broke, her compartments flooded. Somehow, she stayed afloat, but she was out of the war, limping to Singapore, where she would spend the rest of her days as a battered hulk. Meanwhile, Dace attacked from the opposite flank. At 9:56, Claggett fired 4 torpedoes at Maya. Multiple hits detonated her magazines. The ship broke apart and sank in 8 minutes, taking 3/4 of her crew down with her. In less than half an hour, 2 American submarines had erased 2 heavy cruisers, crippled a third, and left the Japanese admiral commanding the center force literally treading water, his charts, staff, and communications gone. Kurita eventually hoisted his flag aboard Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. But the damage was done. His delays and confusion during the following days, the hesitation that let American landing forces survive, began with those torpedo wakes slicing through Palawan Passage. Whether Kurita might have acted differently with his original staff is impossible to know. But Darter and Dace had done more than sink ships. They had shattered command cohesion at the decisive moment of the Pacific War. Leyte Gulf was the Empire's last throw of the dice, and it ended in ruin. Japan lost 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. What remained of the fleet was immobilized, trapped in home waters by the same weapon that had started its undoing, the American submarine. Tankers had been sunk faster than they could be replaced. There was no fuel to train pilots, no oil to sortie ships, no steel to rebuild. When Yamato finally sailed in April 1945 on her one-way mission to Okinawa, she carried just enough fuel to reach the island, not to return. American carrier aircraft caught her halfway there and turned her into a floating volcano. She exploded and sank, taking nearly 2,500 men with her, a monument to the futility of a navy that could no longer move. The decisive battle Japan had planned for decades, the climactic fleet engagement that would settle the Pacific's fate, never truly happened. It was lost piecemeal, torpedo by torpedo, ship by ship, over thousands of miles of ocean. It was lost because Japanese intelligence had fatally misjudged the enemy's weapon and the men who used it. By early 1945, the results bordered on the apocalyptic. American submarines, armed at last with torpedoes that worked, guided by decrypts of Japanese naval codes, and commanded by hardened veterans who had survived the worst years of the war, were sinking Japan's merchant fleet faster than it could be built. The sea lanes that had sustained the empire, the lifelines of oil, ore, food, and soldiers, were gone. Japan was still fighting, but its defeat had already been written beneath the waves. Imagine it, the winter of 1945. The Pacific Ocean, once ruled by the rising sun, had turned into a vast graveyard of steel. Month after month, the sea swallowed Japan's lifeline. In January alone, American submarines sent 252,000 tons of Japanese merchant shipping to the bottom. February, 182,000 tons. March, 269,000. April, another 186,000. Every 30 days, the United States Navy was erasing, several times over, the total amount of tonnage Japan's shipyards could possibly build in an entire year. The arithmetic of destruction was merciless. Japan's shipyards, starved of steel, electricity, and men, could barely turn out 300,000 tons of new shipping per year. And that was under ideal conditions which no longer existed. American submarines were destroying triple that amount every month. How could an island empire survive when its arteries, the merchant ships that fed, fueled, and armed it, were being cut faster than they could be replaced. By August 1945, Japan's merchant fleet had all but ceased to exist. What few ships remained hugged the safety of harbors, too terrified to venture into open water patrolled by American submarines that now owned the Pacific as completely as any force had ever ruled any sea in history. And beneath this tide of strategic collapse lay a human tragedy seldom told, the fate of the merchant sailors themselves. They were civilians, unarmed men hauling cargo, food, and oil across a war-torn ocean. Thousands died in ways too horrific to fully imagine, trapped below decks as torpedoes ripped open hulls, drowned in burning fuel, or perished adrift on lifeboats that never reached shore. Tankers became floating infernos, freighters became coffins of iron and fire. The Imperial Japanese Navy offered them no salvation. There was no organized rescue service, no systematic effort to save those who kept the nation alive. Merchant sailors were seen as expendable, tools, not human beings, in the machinery of empire. Their deaths were simply accepted as part of the cost. And yet, even in this pitiless war, moments of humanity surfaced. Some American commanders, having unleashed their torpedoes under orders of unrestricted warfare, would rise to periscope depth afterward, not to confirm the kill, but to help the survivors. They would offer food, water, and directions to nearby islands. Often, the offers were refused. The survivors, shaped by years of indoctrination that painted Americans as subhuman, would wave off rescue or swim away rather than accept mercy from the enemy. The ocean became not only a battlefield, but a mirror reflecting the consequences of belief and pride. Looking back, one cannot escape the irony. The very weapon that Japan's intelligence officers had dismissed with smug confidence in 1942, the American torpedo, became the instrument of their nation's ruin. When U.S. torpedoes failed early in the war, Japanese analysts concluded the Americans were simply incapable of producing a reliable weapon. That assumption shaped their entire strategy. They doubled down on decisive battle doctrine, obsessed with massive fleet engagements while neglecting convoy protection and anti-submarine defense. But the Americans learned. They tested, fixed, and improved. What had once been a laughingstock became a weapon of precision and reliability. And by the time Japanese intelligence realized the truth, that every flaw had been corrected, it was too late. The ships were already gone. The oil was gone. The lifelines that fed the empire had been severed beyond repair. Victory in the Pacific was not decided solely at Midway or the Philippine Sea, as the grand narratives often suggest. Those battles may have captured the imagination, but the true death blow was struck in silence, beneath the waves, by unseen hunters waging a war of attrition that Japan could not survive. The submarine campaign did not rely on glory or spectacle. It relied on numbers, relentless, pitiless numbers. Tonnage lost versus tonnage built, a simple equation that Japan could never balance. And so, the empire that had sought to dominate the Pacific perished, not in one climactic clash, but in the cold calculus of industrial warfare. American engineering, logistics, and the capacity to learn from failure proved deadlier than any fleet. Japan's intelligence officers had mistaken temporary malfunction for permanent weakness, and that era of imagination, more than any bomb or battle, cost them the war. In the end, the sea, silent, vast, and impartial, became both the judge and the executioner. The submarines Japan once mocked as incompetent had become the noose that strangled its empire, teaching a final brutal truth: that in war, arrogance blinds faster than bullets, and underestimating your enemy is the surest path to annihilation.